Japan Books of Horror Stories, Audiobooks. My wife, Elizabeth, now lies in a hospital in Epsom, her face distorted with fear and disgust. They tell me she screams a lot, even in the daytime. They tell me she'll never be pretty again. Next day we saw the old man again. My wife seemed obsessed by him. This time she went to him and peered at him closely. He had shrunk a great deal. He seemed to be half the size he had been before. Elizabeth could see black sockets behind the glasses. His arms were wrapped in bandages, strapped around him, covered with a shawl. This time there was no crow of delight, no flapping of fingers. No fingers. The old man was a lump of bandaged rotten flesh, limbless, eyeless. Suddenly he said something in a low crackling whisper. The only words Elizabeth had ever heard from him. He said urgently, "Feed them, feed them." I think I knew what was coming, when my wife turned to me and screamed at the top of her voice. I don't know why we whispered. Maybe it was the loneliness of the ruins of the house. Our voices answered out of the dark entrance, the lonely crumbling wall, bitten through by time, the damp steps leading down into the abyss of shadows, almost seemed to radiate in a feeling of, there's no right word for it, something old, unholy, something evil. Evil, especially to us, intruders in its domain. Down there, into the absolute darkness, filled the first seconds with coloured lights and stripes and circles dancing on my irises. Then, after a while, I made out the dark shapes of old furniture, the walls of the cave, and something dark, in a corner of the cellar, something slowly moving. It seemed almost to flow, an indefinable black form, laying flat on the floor. He stretched his hand to touch it, and then Harold cut an arm with a blow of his shovel, and the arm and the hand kept on moving, crawling over the floor. Then Frank heard something outside. Much later I came home to break down in my mother's arms, raving and crying, trying to escape from every shadow in the room. He tried to raise a hand to his throbbing head, but found that he was unable to do so. He almost panicked, but managed to fight back his fear and tried his best to assess the situation. His brain was still befuddled, and he couldn't see very well. He was sitting in almost pitch darkness, and he couldn't move his arms or legs. He could see an oil lamp hanging in the doorway, but it was burning so weakly that it shed hardly any light at all. His heart jumped violently when the lamp started to move towards him. He heard a shuffling, and the light became brighter. He was considerably relieved when he saw that I was carried by the old man. Lim Chong turned up the wick of the lamp with a horny hand, and the bare hut was filled with a light that hurt Harrison's eyes. "What's going on?" Harrison shouted. "Where's Clark?" Lim hung the lamp from a wooden beam, then thrust his wizened face close to that of the American. "Mr. Clark not very far away," he breathed softly. Harrison tried to turn his face away from the foul stench that issued from the old man's mouth, but he couldn't move his head either. In a moment of terror, he realized his position. He was stoutly lashed to a heavy wooden chair, and his head was clamped in some kind of wooden vice, which was presumably, in turn, fastened to one of the vertical hut supports somewhere behind him. For some reason, he had been rendered totally immobile. But why? All he knew was that he was scared stiff. "What is it you want? My money? Then take it, but for God's sake get me out of this contraption." He was screaming, but he couldn't help himself.
Lim Chong had moved behind him, and the vile smell returned as the old man whispered in his ear. "No, sir. We no want your money." Harrison only began to realize what it was all about when he experienced the first stinging pain, as Lim Chong deftly drew a razor-edged knife across his forehead, just below the hairline. Then he knew. He struggled like a madman, but to no avail. He screamed for Clark to help him. But when nobody came, he just screamed, and screamed, and kept screaming. The pain was almost unbearable. He could feel the hair and the flesh being ripped and stripped away from his skull, and he could feel the warm, sticky blood seeping down his neck and running down his face, blurring his vision so that he saw everything through a red mist. His screams increased in both volume and intensity, and his heart pounded in his chest like a sledgehammer. His fear became so total that it began to paralyze him. He could find no strength to continue his useless struggle, and he was finding it hard to breathe. His screams were reduced to babbling pleas for mercy, and finally broke off into hoarse, choking sobs. He began to cry like a child, the salt tears mingling with the blood in his mouth.
There were no flies on Frank that morning. After all, why not? He was a responsible citizen with a wife and child, wasn't he? It was a typical Frank morning, and with an agility that defies description, he leapt into the bathroom onto the scales. To his great Harold, he discovered he was 12 inches more tall heavy. He couldn't believe it, and his blood raced to his head, causing a mighty red colouring. I can't not believe this incredible fact of truth about my very body, which has not gained fat since mother begat me at childburn. Yea, though I walk through the valley of thy shadowy hut, I will feed no Norman. What great qualmsy hath taken me thus into such a fatty hardbuckle? Frank looked sadly at his wife, forgetting for a moment the cause of his misery. Walking slowly but slowly towards her, he took his head in his hands, and with a few swift blows had clubbed her mercifully to the ground dead. She shouldn't see me like this, he mumbled. Not all fat, and on her 32nd birthday. As I write this confession, I consider these words which are drawn in the blood of my lover who is dead. She is without a heart. I cut out her heart. She is without blood. Her blood is for my pen. And presently there will be no more of her and me, for together we will burn and crumble, our organs of ecstasy reduced to a grey, impotent ash. This will be. What has happened is over, and lives only in my mind, in these blood-red words, and in the screams of my wife, whom I can hear through the open doors of my laboratory. I left them open for that reason. By now I believe that I am insane. Yet I am aware of sensations more vivid than in all my sane life of fear. Now I am unable to feel fear. The feeling is good. My wife is screaming, and her screams rise from my operating table. She is strapped there, quite tightly. She is conscious, and before her is the body of Stella, my dead lover. Stella is naked. There is a small hole in her forehead. In the hole is a hemorrhage, and the hemorrhage is oyster to a lead pearl. The bullet which killed her froze her breasts and chilled her succulence. I can see her now, and though she is dead, she excites me. There is another hole beneath her breast. There is blood on her flesh. The blood came from the incision I made when I cut her heart out. Real fear runs through your veins like ice. It crawls upwards under your skin to your neck. It feels like suddenly standing on the brink of an abominable deep pit with crawling emptiness.